Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to take a look at a text-based SAQ that's related to Chapter 25 in your textbooks, and for the wider AP World History course, this corresponds to Africa, all parts of Africa, in Units 3 and Units 4, that is 1450 to 1750. So this SAQ is actually a letter, and we know that because first step always with an SAQ is to go down and look at the source. And so if we look at the source, this is a letter to the King of Portugal, written by King Alfonso of the Congo in 1526. Now, this is actually, I'll start by saying, this is actually a somewhat famous document in AP World History. This has been used many times. I believe it's made an appearance on the AP test at least once already. It's a fairly well-known document in the sense that it represents a indigenous African response to the increasing sort of European influence around the world in terms of trade and in trade goods. And so this is a letter that the King Alfonso I of Congo, that was not his birth name, that is the name Europeans gave him, or he adopted for himself, but Europeans have written down in their history books. I actually don't remember how to say his birth name, but just keep in mind that Alfonso was the name, his Christian name that he took after converting to Christianity early in his reign. And so let us take a look, with that sort of context in mind, let us take a look at this SAQ. It looks like this is part of the letter, not the whole thing, probably. Moreover, sir, in our kingdoms, there is another great inconvenience, which there is little service to God. Interesting. Remember, these are both Christian monarchs. This is that many of our people, keenly desirous as they are of the wares and things of your kingdom, so people want Portuguese goods, seize many of our people, freed and exempt men, and very often it happens that they kidnap even noblemen and the sons of noblemen, take them to be sold to the white men. To avoid such a great evil, we passed a law so that any white man living in our kingdoms and wanting to purchase goods in any way should first inform officials of our court. We know that it is in your service, too, that these goods and slaves taken from our kingdom, otherwise we would not consent to this. So this is interesting because this is talking about the slave trade, which is usually, can't really be avoided as a topic when we're talking about Africa at this point in human history. But this is interesting because this is an African king saying, hey, look, you're kidnapping all of our people, and you shouldn't do that. We're fine selling you slaves, right? We know that it is a service to your kingdom that these slaves are taken from our kingdom. We're cool with that, but you got to talk to us first. See, this was really interesting. The sort of this response to the slave trade. So that's interesting because usually people hear about slavery and they would assume that everybody would have been against it in Africa, but it had been a long tradition in Africa, owning slaves, possessing slaves, going to war to get more slaves. This was a long tradition that I've talked about on some of my history bites. And so this letter is simply saying, hey, can you maybe stop taking so many slaves? You're even kidnapping noblemen and exempt men who are not supposed to be taking slaves. So this is interesting. Let us take a look at the questions that accompany this SAQ. Explain how this letter represents a cultural change in Central Africa. So that's cultural change. This looks like a change in continuity one. Okay. Central Africa. And explain how this letter represents an economic continuity in Africa. Okay. So a cultural change and an economic continuity. And Central Africa in particular for the first one, looks like all of Africa for the second one. It's always important to keep in mind regions and how they're being described. This one does not seem to have an identify statement. Not every SAQ you have will have an identify statement. In this case, it is simply two explain statements. So what I'd like you to do is to go ahead and pause the video and think about possible topics or answers to these questions. And then maybe write them down somewhere and then come back and we'll go over some of the thoughts I had. As usual, it's important to keep in mind there's always two possible answers, or at least two, and probably more. To all of these questions. So there's many ways, as some people would say, there's many ways to skin this cat. Kind of a gross analogy, but pause the video, go have a look, and then come on back. So hopefully you had a chance to have a look and write some things down. Let's take a look at a few things that came to my mind when I first read this. So when talking about a cultural change in Central Africa, I thought of a few things. One would be the introduction of Christianity. That was a pretty big one, and it's pretty on display in the letter. Nothing really to debate there. Christianity had been known in North Africa, West Africa, parts of East Africa, and it's possible that it was known in Central Africa pre-arrival of the Portuguese. There's not a lot of evidence for that. It would go on to play a very large role. Today, Christians make up a large portion of Central Africans' religions. So the introduction of Christianity was a major change. We could talk about that. We know that there were smaller states in Central Africa during this time, but the Congo Kingdom really coalesced around the same time as the Portuguese arrived. That is not to say the Portuguese made the Congo Kingdom, but the Congo Kingdom was able to help centralize its authority through the use of Christianity and through the use of trade revenues they got from trading with the Portuguese. The Kingdom of Congo also had, interestingly enough, its own sigil, sort of a shield that would show up in European maps when talking about the Kingdom of Congo. And technically, it lasted until 1918, when the Portuguese abolished it and incorporated it into their colony of Angola. So we could also be talking about the existence of a Portuguese diaspora of merchants on the nearby island of São Tomé. This was an island off the coast of Africa that the Portuguese had colonized shortly after like the voyages of Prince Henry the Navigator. And so the colony had been, it was mostly Europeans, although it had a high number of African slaves. This was a sugar growing colony, much like the Canary Islands. Interestingly enough, São Tomé was also where the Portuguese king sent a number of expelled Jews that he did not want, children specifically, after he took them from their parents, which is, you know, not the greatest episode in human history in terms of like how we treat each other. So these are all possible answers to this first question, right? We talk about a cultural change. There could also be talk about cultural economic continuity, right? And so the one that just jumps to my mind is African states trade with the outside world. Like that's pretty well known. Like we have lots of examples of this from Unit 1 and Unit 2. You have Mali, you have the Hausa states, you have Great Zimbabwe, you have the Swahili city-states. Like this is nothing new. You've got, you know, the Swahili city-states with the Indian Ocean trading things like ivory and wood, or you have the trans-Saharan trade routes in Mali with Mansa Musa going on his pilgrimage. There's all sorts of examples. Like that's just an easy one that seems to jump out at you. There's also the institution of slavery, which, as I've said before, was a cultural continuity, but it was also an economic continuity. The economic practice of slave raiding and trading for slaves had been in existence in Africa for many, 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 many years. So that could be an economic continuity. I think that one might be a bit trickier to write because you'd need to have a couple of really clear examples, and those aren't super common. But these are just a couple of ways you could approach this. And so what I'd like you to do is go ahead and pause the video and take maybe one of yours, maybe you thought of something I didn't think of, or take one of the ones I have here and go ahead and try to write an SAQ, keeping in mind our acronym ACE, Answer, Cite, Explain, and then come on back and, you know, we take a look at what I wrote. And again, even if I didn't write the exact same thing you wrote, you could take a look at the structure and sort of how I write mine as sort of a gauge to where you might need to improve your own. So pause the video, go take a crack at that and come on back. So I hope you had a chance to go practice writing down an SAQ. Now let's take a look at some of the things that I decided, the things that came to my mind and I decided to write my answers to. So for letter A, I decided to talk about the introduction of Christianity. It just seemed like the easiest one. So answer A, this letter represents a cultural change in the introduction of Christianity to Central Africa. Before the arrival of the Portuguese in the mid-1400s, the main religious practices centered around connections with spirits and natures. You could use the word shamanism, that would be appropriate, although not totally accurate, not a complete picture. You could also say animism, although that term is a little out of date, but it would probably be acceptable. But basically they were nature-based religions and it was not Christianity at the time. You'd want to be careful not to say Islam, because while Islam was big in West Africa, East Africa, and North Africa, the penetration of Muslims into Central Africa did not really occur. And it's again part of the reason why in Central Africa, Christianity is the dominant religion and not Islam like it is in East, North, and parts of West Africa. So with the arrival of the Portuguese, Christianity found favor with the Congo kings, who converted to Christianity, even translated the Bible into Congolese, making Christianity popular among the elite. So this is a cultural change from the previous religious situation. So what you could potentially do, the way you could mix up my answer for A is you could potentially talk about these things up here, and maybe move this sentence down here. That would probably also be acceptable. But simply, you need to demonstrate that there was a change, right? And so there was a situation where the spirits and nature and shamans were the main religious central practices. And then you have a situation where Christianity becomes the central religious practice. And this changed because the kings were in favor of doing this. Now, it's important to note, just like with West Africa, during this time, it was mostly the kings who adopted the religion. It was not necessarily everybody who adopted the religion. So it's always important to keep that in mind when we're talking about Africa. Also, this translating the Bible into Congolese, little bit of syncretism. I know we love that word. So B, I decided to go with the continued participation of Africa in international trade. Again, real easy. And you should never like be ashamed or like be afraid of just going for the easy one. There's no problem with doing that. In fact, you know, it's a survival strategy when it comes to the AP test. Go with what you know. So this letter represents a continuity of Africa's international trade, right? Africa's participation in international trade. In earlier history, the trans-Saharan trade route was one of the main sources of gold for the rest of the world. We know this from the Islamic world. We know this from the European world, and it continued to be even after the voyages of exploration. This letter shows that human cargo is now a major trade good for the Portuguese in their New World colonies, demonstrating Africa's participation in world trade, a continuing participation in world trade. I could have phrased that a little bit better, but in general, you can see how we had a situation earlier in history with the trans-Saharan trade route and gold, and now we have this Atlantic trade route with human cargo and slaves. Not making a value judgment about the trade in gold versus the trade in humans, but you can see how we've demonstrated a continuity in international trade and how we've cited a very specific example, trans-Saharan trade route, and a very specific trade good, gold, and now we're talking about human cargo headed for the New World. And so we've demonstrated that there's a continuity. And we can do this again because the question does not specify a region of Africa, it just says Africa as a whole. Now, maybe it would have said Atlantic Africa, since we were talking about West and Central on the Atlantic coast. But either way, it's important to read those questions carefully so that you can come up with an excellent answer. I hope this helped. I want to thank you for joining me. My name is Mr. Little, and I will see you next time.